It was a full decade ago, in the spring of '89, and I had been lingering alone on this hill for close to 30 years, waiting for my death, biding my time, helpless and silent as smoke, and with all the patience of the long dead. I was waiting not so much for my actual death, which meant little to me one way or the other, as for the pine box that contained my bones to be carried 3,000 miles back along the railroad lines to my family's house and farm in the Adirondack mountain village of North Elba, New York, to the place that, because of the Negroes living there, we called Timbuktu. A letter from a distinguished woman in the East arrived at my door. It informed me of the coming reinterment of the last of the bodies of those who had fallen with Father at Harper's Ferry. The letter invited me to attend the ceremonies, which were to be held on the upcoming 9th of May, Father's birthday, at his gravesite, where my brother's and companions' old bones were at last to join his. My return to Timbuktu was closer to dream than to a lived thing, or even to a memory. A snowflake passed by my face, and then several more. The wet flakes struck my beard and body, and, amazed, I watched them melt away as fast as they fell. The snow shower blew over, and suddenly I realized that I was not alone on the road. A short ways ahead of me, a group of perhaps a dozen children and a pair of young women walked steadily along in the same direction. They were white people. I note that because when I turned and glanced behind me, I saw an elderly Negro couple coming slowly along. They each carried what appeared to be a Bible. Then behind them came 6 or 7 Negro people of various ages, at least 3 generations. There was a dark-faced man among them who for a second I thought was Father's dear friend and mine, Mr. Lyman Epps. I was somewhat disoriented, however, due to fear and excitement, and could not be sure. Hadn't he died long ago? Was this his son, perhaps? The first time that I walked this path to our farm was back in '49, when I came with the family and Lyman Epps, and saw the house here on the southern end of the promontory called the Tableland, but which Father insisted would be called the Plains of Abraham. In his usual way, he had imagined everything for us beforehand. The house was as he had said, and the barn would be exactly where he drove his stakes, facing due southeast across the Plains of Abraham into the mighty Tawas, as the Iroquois had named it, the Cloudsplitter. 7 years later, I walked up to this place accompanied by a dead man's body and fled this house and valley for Ohio and then Kansas. 3 years after that, the old man and I came home for the even more portentous departure for Harper's Ferry. But in between, and before and after, there were the thousands of easy domestic comings and goings that a farming family is obliged to make. Daily we walked and sometimes rode this line back through the woods that linked our home to the larger world, beating a footpath into a track, and a track into a road, which connected eventually to all the other roads that we would travel together, and alone. Considered in all the tossed and turbulent terms of my life, this fading path through the woods was like the central nerve of my body. Everything of moment branched off that nerve. Everything, in a sense, originated there, and ultimately everything must loop back and end there. And so, apparently, it had. For here I was, walking it again. A vast crowd of people had assembled. A significant number appeared by their dress and bearing to be personages of no slight importance in the world, reverends and top-hatted bankers and the such. I saw a lot of Negro people there, too. Poorer folks than the whites, most of them elderly. The huge throng was assembled in a vast semicircle as if in an ancient amphitheater, between the old house and barn and the great gray stone in the center. At the center of the arc of the crowd was the huge gray rock, intimidating, mysterious. Next to it stood the old Puritan-style slate gravestone that memorialized the death of great-grandfather John Brown, Father's namesake, which Father had lugged up from Connecticut. The worn slab marked Father's own grave now. A short ways beyond the rock was a mast-high flagpole with no flag a-flying, and at its base 3 lines of soldiers in dress uniform had assembled formally in drill order, standing at parade rest. Most of the people stood idly by, talking lightly and taking their ease. Their attention seemed to be directed with intermittent watchfulness towards Father's rock at the front, and I moved in that same direction myself. Barely the top of it was visible to me as I passed through the multitude, but I was drawn straight and swiftly to it as if the rock had been magnetized and I were a pin on a leaf afloat in water. And suddenly there I was, clear of the crowd and standing alone before the great gray stone. It seemed to shine in the milky morning light, and its surface was coldly clarified and dry, like the skin of a statue of a mythological beast. As I neared the rock, everything else blurred. The crowd of people, the house and barn, the mountains around, and faded altogether from my view. All was silent. A stone carver, some time in the year since I had seen it last, had cut into the rock Father's name and the year of his execution. I looked upon them now, and I fairly heard, instead of read, the name and year spoken aloud in Father's own unmistakable voice. John Brown, 1859. Then I looked down to my left and saw the hole in the ground. The hole was pure black, like carbon, about 6 feet across and 6 wide. It was freshly dug and deep. From where I stood, I could not see the bottom. I turned away from the huge boulder and moved slowly towards the 6-foot square of blackness, and felt an almost irresistible tug to go forward and enter it, to step off this too solid earth into blackness, as if taking that final step were as simple as walking through the portal of one room into the next. I stopped, but could not say what stopped me. Gradually, though, I began to hear noises again. Dogs barked, children cried and laughed. Men and women chattered with one another. Horses creaked in their harnesses and wagon wheels crunched across the ground. A crow called out. When I found myself once again in the midst of the spectacle and not cast outside it, I was able to back quickly away from the black hole, to turn and move off from Father's rock, there to take up an obscure position in the middle of the crowd, to stand and wait with them. I was waiting now, like the others, for the speeches, the prayers, and the singing of the hymns, for the ornate box of the crumbling remains of 11 murdered men to be lowered into the ground. Watson Brown, Oliver Brown, Albert Hazlett, John Henry Caggie, Lewis Leary, William Lehman, Dangerfield Newby, Aaron Stevens, Stuart Taylor, Dauphin Thompson, William Thompson. And also the body of this man, Owen Brown, who had lived for so many years longer than the others, brought back to join the bodies of his martyred brothers and compatriots in the grave beside his father's grave. But instead, I stood aside and watched as the remains of those 11 men disappeared into the black hole. There were songs, prayers, and speeches, and then the flag went up, and the soldiers fired their guns into the air in full military salute. The Negro man who so resembled Lyman Epps Was it Lyman's son? Stepped forward and in a trembling, sweet tenor voice sang the old man's hymn, "Blow ye trumpets, blow." And finally the crowd dispersed. I remained there at our old farm, alone. Alone to face these somber graves at the foot of the great granite stone. Alone before the cold spring wind blowing across the plain from Tawas, the Cloudsplitter. What really happened at the Potawatomi massacre? Why did old man Brown go down into Harper's Ferry and stay there long after he could have come out alive? Why did he take his sons and his sons-in-law and all those other fine young men to certain death with him? How did his third son, Owen Brown, come to be the one son who escaped? I had believed that it was my task to tell Father's untold story, to fill out the historical record with my eyewitness account so as to revise once and for all the received truth about John Brown and his sons and followers. But now it seems that I am not so much revising history as making a confession of a crime, a terrible secret crime which would have remained safely hidden, a crime still known by me alone. A dead man confesses to other dead men so that he may join them. I confess to mere acquaintances and strangers too. I confess to all the men and women, Negro and white, who believed in Father and his mission, who gave him their life's trust and treasure, and even gave him their sons and brothers. Until Mother died, we Browns had been to all appearances a normal family of our time and place, if a bit overly strict in matters of religion. After that, we became like some ancient Hebrew tribe of wanderers and sufferers. It was as if, after Mother died, we moved outside of conventional time and wandered with our herds and puny belongings through some distant land and epoch, so that we were not living in Ohio, but in Canaan, not in Pennsylvania, but among the Philistines, not in Massachusetts, but in Pharaoh's Egypt. Wherever we lived in those days, wherever we set up our house and farm and commenced doing business with our neighbors, we were like an island in a sea of chicanery, godlessness, disorder, and willful ignorance. We were surrounded not just by wilderness, but by reckless sinners. When it came to the sin of owning slaves, which Father labeled not sin, but evil, all his loathing came down at once and in a very personal way upon the head of the evildoer. He brooked no fine distinctions. The man who pleaded for the kindly treatment of human chattel or argued for the gradual elimination of slavery was just as evil as the man who whipped, branded, raped, and slew his slaves. And he who did not loudly oppose the extension of slavery into the Western territories was as despicable as he who hounded escaped slaves all the way to Canada and branded them on the spot to punish them and to make pursuit and capture easier next time. But with the notable exception of where a man or woman stood on the question of slavery, Father did not condemn or set himself off from our neighbors. He merely observed their ways and passed silently by. And he knew all the ways of men and women extremely well. My father was not the sort of man who stopped up his ears at the sound of foul language or shut his eyes to the lasciviousness and sensuality that passed daily before him. Nothing human beings did with or to one another or themselves shocked him. Only slavery shocked him. There is a particular important book in our life as a family. The book is called American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. We were seated around the fire in the kitchen of the old haymaker place in Hudson, Ohio. Father opened it up to the first page and, with his voice very loud, commenced to read. After he had read for several moments, he passed the book to us and bade each in turn to read from it. First, my stepmother Mary read, haltingly and sometimes stumbling over unfamiliar words. Then my brother John, who was 18 years of age that winter, rapidly read a page or two, and after him, Jason, who was 17, in a voice that was almost a whisper, took his place. Finally, the book came to me, and I began to read. We will prove by a cloud of witnesses that the slaves are whipped with such inhuman severity as to lacerate and mangle their flesh in the most shocking manner, leaving permanent scars and ridges. The testimony will be that of the slaveholders themselves, and in their own words, taken from the advertisements which they have published in their own newspapers, describing their runaway slaves by the scars on their bodies made by the whip. I stopped and looked up at Father, expecting him to reach forward for the book, but he merely nodded for me to go on. Witness, Mr. D. Judd, jailer, Davidson County, Tennessee, in the Nashville Banner, December 10th, 1838. Testimony: committed to jail as a runaway, a Negro woman named Martha, 17 or 18 years of age, has numerous scars of the whip on her back. Witness, Mr. Robert Nickel, Mobile, Alabama, in the Mobile Commercial Advertiser, October 30th, 1838. Testimony: $10 reward for my woman, Sibby, very much scarred about the neck and ears by whipping. Witness, Mr. H. Verilat, New Orleans, Louisiana, in the Commercial Bulletin, August 27, 1838. Testimony: ran away the Negro slave named Jupiter, has a fresh mark of a cow skin on one of his cheeks. With trembling hand, I delivered the book across to Father, who, throughout, had sat peering somberly into the fire that blazed in the great open fireplace. He brought the book near to his face, as he customarily did, and in his reedy voice continued where I had left off. The slaves are often branded with hot irons, pursued with firearms and shot, hunted with dogs and torn by them, shockingly maimed with knives, dirks, etc., have their ears cut off, their eyes knocked out, their bones dislocated and broken with bludgeons, their fingers and toes cut off, their faces and other parts of their persons disfigured with scars and gashes, besides those made with the lash. Then Father passed the book over to me and said, Owen, thou hast still at times the voice of a child. Read these words so that we may better hear in thy innocent voice their terrible indicting evil. Not fully understanding, I nonetheless obeyed and read on. Witness, Mr. Micah Ricks, Nash County, North Carolina, in the Raleigh Standard, July 18, 1838. Testimony: ran away a Negro woman and 2 children. A few days before she went off, I burned her with a hot iron on the left side of her face. I tried to make the letter M. Witness, Mr. William Overstreet, Benton, Yazoo County, Mississippi, in the Lexington, Kentucky Observer, July 22nd, 1838. Testimony: ran away a Negro man named Henry, his left eye out, some scars from a dirk on and under his left arm, and much scarred with the whip. Witness, Mr. J. Scribner, Herring Bay, Anne Arundel County, Maryland, in the Annapolis Republican, April 18, 1837. Testimony: ran away a Negro man, Elijah, has a scar on his left cheek, apparently occasioned by a shot. Long into the winter night I read. My breath caught in my throat, my eyes watered over, my hands trembled, and it seemed that I could not go on saying the words that described such incredible cruelties. Yet I continued. It was as if I were merely the voice for all 5 of us seated together in that candle-lit room before the fire, and we were together very like a single person. Father, Mary, John, Jason, and I, bound together by a vision of the charnel house of Negro slavery. Despite our earnest desires, especially Father's, all that we had shared as a family had proved incapable of making our blood ties mystical and transcendent. It took the sudden, unexpected sharing of a vision of the fate of our Negro brethren to do it. We saw it at once, and we saw it together. The vision was like a flame that melted us, and afterwards, when it finally cooled, we had been hardened into a new and unexpected shape. We had been recast as a single entity, and each one of us had been forged and hammered into an inseparable part of the whole. Slowly, Father got up from his chair and placed a fresh log on the dying fire, and stayed there, his back to us. Without turning, he began to speak. My children, the years of my life are passing swiftly. He fisted his hands and placed them before his eyes like a child about to weep. He said that while he had been idling selfishly and in sinful distraction, lured by his vanity and by pathetic dreams of wealth and fame, the slavers had dug in deeper all across the southern states. They had spread out like fetid waters flooding into Texas and the territories. They had steadily entrenched themselves in Washington, until now the poor slaves could no longer even raise their voices to cry for help without being slain for it or being swiftly sold off into Alabama and Mississippi. My children, he said, it's mobs that rule us now, and all the while Mr. Garrison and his anti-slavery socialites bray and pray and keep their soft pink hands clean. Politicians keep on politicking. For the businessmen, it's business as usual. Father cursed them all, and he cursed himself for his weakness and his vanity, he said. He turned to us and crossed his arms over his chest. I was frightened by my father's face. I remember recoiling from him as if he himself were one of the guardian serpents. He would go out from here and wage war on slavery. And I mean to make war by force and arms. I mean to make the sort of war that was waged by the great Negroes, Sink, Nat Turner, and Louverture, and by the Roman slave Spartacus. Which of you is willing to make common cause with me? He put the question to us one by one. Are you, Mary, John, Jason, Owen? Each of us, in turn, softly answered yes. During his lifetime, like all abolitionists, Father was a much despised man, and not just slaveholders hated him. He was hated by white people generally, and after Kansas and Harper's Ferry, and during the Civil War years and beyond, even to today, he was reviled by Southerners and Copperheads, and even by many who had long supported the abolitionist cause. He was also widely admired and even loved, passionately and almost universally, by Negroes and by the more radical white abolitionists, and he was celebrated and sung by all the most famous poets, writers, and philosophers here and abroad. Back in '48, in Springfield, Massachusetts, black or white, they did not know who John Brown was. There was a day coming, however, and not far off, when the whole world would know his name. that he is a white man and in the interests of Negroes has coldly killed other white men will become the most important thing about him. That was the winter and spring when we lived in Springfield in a neighborhood of mostly Negro freedmen, people who were even poorer than we. We were content, however, because for the first time in several years, we were residing together, a regular family, and Father was not working someplace far off. Even John, with his new wife, Wealthy, was with us that year, helping run Mr. Perkins' wool warehouse. This left Father free to pursue his several projects concerning the welfare and future of the Negroes in Springfield, who that year were particularly alarmed by the growing number of slave catchers prowling through northern cities. Father's abolitionist work had taken on a new intensity and freshened singleness of purpose. I was 24 years old that winter, and Springfield was the largest town I had ever seen. The regular proximity of exotic, or so they seemed to me, young women kept me in an agitated state of mind and body, and I spent many an evening and early morning hour walking the streets as to be alone with my tangled thoughts and feelings. Thus I little noticed the worsening illness of the baby Ellen, and I did not realize that Mary had not fully recovered from her lying-in period. No wonder Father seemed short with me that spring. Then, one night, late in April, a few weeks before we planned to depart for our new home in the Adirondacks, I left the house in an unusually heightened state of alarm. I felt I had reached a fork in my road, and if I did not take a turning now, I would be forever bound to follow the track I was on. A foolish desperation, I know, but the oncoming move to the wilderness of North Elba frightened me. I sullenly announced that I would be going out to say goodbye to a few friends, since I did not expect to see them again. So deluded was I that I had grown angry at them, at Father especially, for not having asked me where I was going, who were my friends, why did I need to tell them goodbye with 2 weeks yet to go before we left. In a huff, then, and puffed up with self-righteous relief, I made my way downtown towards the dark, broad Connecticut River where barges and sloops and Long Island coasters tied up at the docks and their crews and the stevedores gathered in dim, smoky taverns. There were women waiting for the company and pay of lonely men and boys who came ashore for a night or two. Women waiting for the drovers and woodcutters from the hills of Vermont and New Hampshire to come in from the marketplaces of the town, with fresh money in their pockets and reckless intentions in their hearts. Women. The mere idea of femaleness made me mad with desire, although I knew not what it was exactly that I desired. Sex, copulation, simple, carnal love. All that, I suppose, all that. But something else, too. I craved knowledge of a sort that up to then I'd had no access to. The unmistakable smell of a woman, the touch of her soft skin, the flow of her hair across my hand, the sound of a woman's whispered voice in my ear, even the sight of her naked body. It was a warm night. I strode along, determined not to leave this town without learning at least something of what I was sure I would miss afterwards, for the remainder of my life, it seemed. I felt that I had reached the end of a conscripted childhood and was about to begin a similarly conscripted adult life. But on this April night, for a few hours at least, I meant to be a free man. I saw several women and avoided passing each one by crossing the street to the other side, but then came one I could not avoid, and after I had passed her by with my habitually averted gaze, She called out, "Hello, Red. Would you be needing company tonight?" She was red-haired herself, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, with bright white powder all over her face and a broad slash of painted lips and smudged blackened eyes. She wore erratic scraps of cloth elaborately draped across her shoulders, wrapped, sashed, and pinned so as to suggest an exotic gown, although it was more a child's motley costume than a woman's dress. I stopped and turned back, and she said, with a curl to her voice and a pronunciation that was noticeably Irish, "You're a big feller, ain't you now?" Because I could see that she was a child, she did not frighten me as a full-grown woman would, and I took a step towards her. I have no money," I said to her. "Oh, come on now, a nicely dressed fella like yourself." "Yes, I live not far from here. I'm just out for a walk. I like to be by the river." "Then what do you want with me?" She took a backward step into the deeper shadows. Nothing. Just, I'm sorry, miss. I didn't mean to scare you." "You didn't scare me." "I won't hurt you," I whispered. "You can't touch me unless you pay." I reached into my pocket and drew out the few coins, copper pennies, enough for a single loaf of bread, no more. "Here, this is all I got." Looking warily at me, she half turned and opened her tiny hand. I passed her the coins, and they disappeared into her rags at once. I peered down at my feet, embarrassed and unsure of what to do next, and when I looked up again, the girl had slid down along the wall and was about to bolt. "Hey, where are you off to?" "No place," she said, alarmed, and stood stock still, half hidden in the darkness. "But you took my money." "Oh, you don't get much for coppers, you know." "Come here, and be nice, mister. Don't fret none. I'll give you some of what you want, darling. Come here now." Then, suddenly, it was she who had touched me. Her hand stroked me between my thighs, and a second later she was unbuttoning me, using both her hands. Before I could fully register what was happening, it was over. She was standing and wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, a distant look on her face as if she were calculating the few measly items that she might purchase with the pennies I had given her. I turned away and quickly buttoned my trousers. I'm sorry," I said without looking around at her. "What for?" I turned and faced her. She drew her shawl over her scrawny shoulders and seemed about to leave. "Well, that, I guess." "Oh, you got what you paid for, no more." "Yes, I know, you're right. Well, it's terribly wrong, that's all, and I'm sorry for that." She shrugged and started off. "Goodbye, dearie. Come back when you get your wages." "Wait," I called. "Don't go yet. I was wondering if I might look at you. I'm sorry, I thought I wonder if you might let me see you." "Look at me? What do you mean? My bubbies you want to see?" "Yes, and the other. Please, just let me go now, mister." "First, let me look at you. Then you can go. I won't hurt you." "Just my bubbies?" "Yes." "Not the other?" "No." Slowly, she unwrapped her arms, reached under her shawl, and fumbled momentarily with the buttons of her frock, and then she drew the clothing aside and showed me herself. A bony pink chest with tiny breasts. For a second only, I stared, wishing suddenly that I were as able as she to open my own shirt and bare my breast and have it be the breast of a boy, and not my thick, heavy-haired chest, so that even as I humiliated her, I frankly envied her. When at last I realized what I was doing and was shot through with shame and looked away. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me," I said. "Please cover yourself. I'm so sorry to have done this to you." Then, suddenly, not knowing what else to do, I got down on my knees before her and hung my head. "Well, you are some crack-brained cull, mister," the girl said. She stepped around my prostrate form, and I heard her footsteps clack against the stone as she made her escape. I walked for hours after that, aimless, confused, frightened by the appalling knowledge I had obtained. I knew myself now to be vile, a beast. On my own like this, away from father and the rest of the family, cut loose from the virtue generated, sustained, and perfected among them, I was but a sack of contradictions and unpredictable impulses. Burdened with thoughts such as these, I slowly made my sorrowful way home, arriving sometime in the middle of the night. The house was not darkened as I had expected, and when I entered I was greeted by Ruth and John and Wealthy, all in their night clothes, gathered together in the kitchen, comforting our stepmother, Mary. She had been weeping. I saw at once, and when I asked what had happened, John swiftly took me aside and informed me that the baby Ellen had died just minutes before. Father was still with her upstairs, and he could not be separated from the infant. I remember John saying, "The old man can't seem to let this one go." He did not ask me where I had been until this late hour. No one asked. Clearly and rightly, my private adventures and torment were of no account here. Suddenly, there was Father, entering the kitchen, his arms hanging at his sides, head lowered, tears streaming down his face. I had never seen Father weep before, and the sight astonished and frightened me. He sat next to his wife, placed his hands against his face, and wept openly as a child. No one said a word. This was beyond our understanding. He had lost at that time fully half a dozen of his babies, and he had not wept over any of them, although he had grieved deeply over them all, even to despair. His belief in the life hereafter had always been sufficiently strong that he could view their early going as a gift from God for the children and a trial for him. But somehow this was different. It was as if he believed that he was being punished. "The Lord is filled with wrath against me," he cried. "The Lord despiseth me." "No, no, Father," we tried to console him. Several of us wept with him, although I did not. I could not. I watched in shame, for I knew the true cause of Father's suffering. I was the cause. I knew that Father was blaming himself for my sins, condemning himself for not having interceded with me in my frequent lustful wanderings, which surely he had observed and marked. And now he believed that he was being punished by an angry God for his inattention. Slowly, I came forward. "I'm sorry, Father, for what I've done. I have sinned, and I am sorry. Please, Father, please forgive me." He ceased weeping and looked straight into my face. His great gray eyes penetrated to my very soul, and he did not flinch at what he saw there, and I did not squirm away from his gaze, much as I wanted to. "Owen, my son, you are a good boy, Owen. I forgive thee," he said in a low voice, and he drew me to him. "The Lord hath taken one child from me, and returned to me another who was lost. I welcome thee, Owen," he said, and it was as if his words had cleansed me, for at once I felt uplifted and strong again. Whatever Father wished me now to do, I would do without argument, without hesitancy, without fear. It was in the spring of '50, almost a half-century ago, that I met Lyman Epps, when we all first came to North Elba. There was no arguing with Father on this matter of our settling amongst the Negroes in North Elba. He was dead set on it. They were freed men, a few were doubtless fugitives, and the wealthy New York abolitionist Mr. Gerrit Smith had deeded them 40 acres per family from his vast holdings in the Adirondacks. But in a few short years, the rigors of North Country farming had, for the most part, defeated them, and the little colony was coming rapidly undone. Father's agreement with Mr. Smith was that in exchange for a sizable piece of land with an abandoned house on it to be paid for later, we would move there and teach the Negroes how to organize and work their land. There were many such utopian schemes and projects afoot in those years, but Timbuktu may have been the only one that aimed at setting an example of racial harmony. This would be our errand into the wilderness, he said. Father turned 50 that spring. Mary was 37. It was a fresh start, and Father's reveries and fantasies about the place had convinced her that our life would finally be calm and organized. Watson and Salmon, who were 14 and 13 years old that spring, and I brought Father's Devon cattle and his 5 Spanish Merino sheep up along the Connecticut River from Litchfield overland to Rutland, Vermont, and passed around the bottom of Lake Champlain to New York by the Fort Ticonderoga route. The old man, Mary, Ruth, and the younger children, Oliver, Annie, and little Sarah, had come north from Springfield in the wagon with all our tools and domestic goods, a pig, some fowl, and our dogs. They had arrived in Westport, New York, and set up camp a few days before we got there. By the time we showed up, Father had already purchased the supplies we would need to see us through our first harvest. But as soon as I saw the size of the load, I knew that Father's old horse would prove too feeble to haul it on the flats, let alone over high mountains. With regret, he decided to sell his precious old horse, Dan, and use his last remaining cash money to buy a team from the shipping agent in Westport, a Mr. Thurston Clark. As it turned out, Mr. Clark offered Father a chance to hold on to his money, but the old man gave it over. The red-coated Devon cattle had aroused considerable admiration among the local people, and Father was briefly tempted by Mr. Clark to swap a pair straight across for a team of Narragansetts. At the last minute, Father declined the offer. The reason was the presence of a black man from North Elba, Lyman Epps. Mr. Epps, as Father always addressed him, to the frequent consternation of any white people who were present. The man wandered into our camp, and he swiftly proved to be an intelligent, charming man, although I confess that I did not warm to him as quickly as did the others. He was one of Gerrit Smith's settled freedmen, a well-spoken man in his early 30s, I guessed, who had been a blacksmith in Maryland and knew horses. He told us that he had come down in search of work. He needed cash to buy seed because his crops from the previous year had failed, and all his reserves were gone, and he had no more credit at the feed stores or suppliers in the area. But he had been turned away by every blacksmith and harrier in the village due to his race. In the process, however, he had learned of Father's presence in town, the abolitionist fool from Ohio, bent on teaching Gerrit Smith's niggers to farm in the mountains. Father, as usual, had made no secret of our intentions, and we, like the Negroes, had quickly become something of a local joke. On the subject of horses, the man was positively brilliant, or should I say, he talked brilliantly. Such talk pleased the old man immensely, and soon he was inviting Mr. Epps to advise him on the purchase of a new team. It was a subject on which Mr. Epps considered himself capable of sounding like an expert.